And if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to go ahead and start the introductions. And during that time, it'll kind of buy us some time so we can really spend time with our panelists here today. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Mary Kamiyu Danico, Director of the Weglyn Endowed Chair for Multicultural Studies at Cal Poly Pomona. It is such a thrill for me to co-host this first webinar series through the Weglyn Social Justice Initiative, along with Athlete Ally. And so just before I start with land acknowledgement, I really wanted to give a special thanks to Annabeth and Dr. Faye Wax for bringing all of this together and ensuring that we have this robust conversation that I hope will inspire us, in many ways. I also want to give a special thanks to Daniela Castillo, who's our awesome Weglyn intern who has been with me along the way to ensure that we have this incredible programming move smoothly. So I wanted to start off with land acknowledgement, and excuse me while I look to the side and read, or actually I can move my iPad right over here. It is the Cal Poly Pomona through the Native American Student Center and land acknowledgement. We at Cal Poly Pomona respectfully acknowledge the original caretakers of this land, the Tongva peoples, and all their ancestors, elders, and descendants, past, present, and emerging. We also recognize the land known as Los Angeles County today is also home to many Indigenous peoples from all over, and we're grateful for the opportunity to live and work here as guests of these lands, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tongva, and where I currently am in the Gabrielino peoples. So thank you very much. For those of you who are new to our Weglyn Social Justice series, it is my tremendous honor to be able to be the director of the Endowed Chair. And one of the core values of this endowment is to promote social justice work and social justice more broadly defined. Michi and Walter Weglyn were both survivors of the internment and of the Holocaust. And as really dear friends of our former president, Bob Suzuki, and his partner, Agnes, they really wanted to gift this endowment to our campus to ensure that the legacy of work of social justice, to ensure that what they went through as former internees and Holocaust survivors never happens to anyone. And they had the wherewithal to understand the importance of inclusivity. Agnes Suzuki in particular was one of the biggest champions for our Pride Center. And from the inception of the Pride Center, the LGBTQ center here on campus, she attended every single Lavender graduation from the inception. And one of the sweetest things that she did that our former coordinator, Johnny Owens, would share is that she would come in lavender suit, for the occasion. And she also championed for transgender students who are having challenges on our campus. So I know that Bob and Agnes would also be really excited to know that we're finally able to hold this session together. Our collaboration with Athlete Allies leads me to introduce our MCs for the event. And we, as the Weglyn at Cal Poly Pomona folks, will be behind the scenes, kind of moderating the Q&A for all of you. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing Ryan and Jenna, who will be our MCs and who will just take on the show. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us.
Mary, thank you for the fantastic intro, and thank you to everybody involved in the Weglyn series for including us in this really important discussion. I know that I was super stoked to get the invite to this event, and then incredibly excited to have my colleagues and friends here for the remainder of this discussion. So I'm gonna let Jenna introduce herself, and then we'll kick things off.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Hello, folks. Good afternoon. At least it's just past the afternoon here on the West Coast. My name is Jenna Weiner. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I work for Athlete Ally as a research fellow. I'm currently living in San Francisco. So a little bit about Athlete Ally. For those of you who don't know, Athlete Ally works on LGBTQ plus inclusion in sports across the board, at all different levels and offers trainings, does plenty of research, has programming that includes a number of campus chapters at different colleges and universities across the country, and also hosts an annual Action Awards, which are coming up on October 26th and is Athlete Ally's largest fundraiser. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and go to Athlete Ally's website, athleteally.org, for more information on the Action Awards that are coming up. And we also, of course, do panels just like this. So I will go ahead and pass it along to Yeja to introduce themselves. And for all the panelists, if you could please tell us your name, your pronouns, and a bit about your athletic background and the work that you do.
Thank you for that intro. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I'm over on the East Coast, so it's just past 3 o'clock in Boston, Massachusetts. So my name is Yeja Dunn. They, them pronouns. I've been playing rugby competitively for about 9 years now. Starting in college, was a club sport, and then moving to NCAA D1 varsity, graduating into senior club rugby, playing in Boston and playing kind of semi-competitive rugby just below the national team level for about 4 or 5 years now. So continue to play in that league, shooting kind of aspirations for the national team, kind of combating injuries along the way. Within the rugby field, I try to be an advocate for trans and non-binary athletes. It's a new space, and I find that within rugby, it's such a powerful sport in terms of how you use your body. It really allows anybody of all body types to play. And it's just a great space to really look at inclusion and what's possible. So I do a lot of advocacy within that realm.
Awesome. Thanks, Yeja. I can jump in next. My name is Shane Diamond. My pronouns are he, him. I manage the impact campaign for a documentary film called Changing the Game, about 3 transgender high school student athletes as they fight to compete as their authentic selves in their respective sports. I grew up playing ice hockey and soccer and tennis. I played women's varsity ice hockey at Bowdoin College, where I was the 3rd all-time record holder for penalty minutes. And now do a slew of trying to stay in shape sports. But I'm getting back on the ice this weekend with a group of queer and trans folks here in Brooklyn, where I live. And I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, my name is Emmett Marwell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the policy and programs manager at Athlete Ally. And before that, I mean, I don't know, athletics has been, my life since I was like 3 years old. Started playing soccer, and then growing up, there was like t-ball and tennis and basketball, ultimately, and running. I still have trouble imagining myself being a runner, but I was for a short time. Not something I do now. But then I picked up field hockey, ended up playing for a hot minute at Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts, which is where I am right now, and then transitioned and wasn't able to keep playing because I started hormone therapy, and there's no men's field hockey in the US at the collegiate level, at least. And so became team manager. I've done some coaching, and now I'm at Athlete Ally.
And
oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, thanks. And I'll add in a couple of other details. So I'm Ryan Sokolow, he, him pronouns. I am a co-fellow for Athlete Ally, along with Jenner and 3 others. And I played field hockey and lacrosse at Endowed College, which is in coastal Massachusetts, go North Shore. And I don't know, I'm a grilled cheese aficionado. But lastly, I'm a MC of this panel, and I'm super excited to be talking about our stories today. And so I'm going to kick something off that, kick off a theme that has been really prevalent in all of our advocacy. So I'm going to direct this question to Shane and ask if he can talk a little bit about the importance of hearing trans stories and trans athletes, hearing trans stories of trans athletes by trans athletes.
That's a great question, Ryan. Thank you so much for letting me speak to this. So 2021 has been a pretty horrific year for anti-LGBTQ legislation. Just today or yesterday, I believe, the Texas House voted to advance a bill that would ban trans athletes from participating in sports, trans youth. And this is not new. It's been quite the horrific year, and we're anticipating, those of us in the movement are anticipating 2022 being even worse. So stick around, because I'm sure we're going to have some tips on ways that y'all can get involved and help protect trans youth as we get later into this panel. But so much of that narrative that we're hearing as folks and legislators and frankly adults are targeting trans children is they're telling stories about trans children without giving trans children the voice. We are seeing, of course, rock star children testifying, and every time they testify, they say, I should be out playing with sticks and rocks. I shouldn't be here testifying in front of adults. And that's one of the things I truly love about Changing the Game. It centers 3 transgender high school student athletes, as I said, Mac Beggs, a wrestler in Texas, Sarah Rose Huckman, who's a cross-country skier in New Hampshire, and Andrea Yearwood, and later Terry Miller, both of whom are Black trans women in Connecticut who were running track. And when we allow trans people to tell our own stories, whether it is about our journeys in athletics or about our lived experience, we are shifting the perspective. And the film does a beautiful job talking about trans joy and the success and the beauty and the complexity and the miraculousness of being trans. And we are humans, we are people, we have feelings, we wanna participate in life to the fullest, just as everyone else. And when at a time when the narrative is being taken away from us, lose sight of that humanity in trans people, as we do with all people. So the more we can center trans folks telling our own stories, if it's in film and TV, if it's in narrative, if it's I don't know, I do stand-up comedy, so I tell trans jokes, right? We want to have trans voices everywhere because we are everywhere. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who has something to say about the importance of centering trans voices, as we have a panel full of trans people. So if anyone wants to jump in, please, I don't need to suck the air out of this one.
Sounds good. Thanks, Shane, for taking our first question. Yeah, I'll just share a little bit about my athletic background as well. I am an ultimate frisbee and disc golf player, have been for about a decade at least for both of those as well. And for me, I'm a queer transgender woman athlete. And for me, that process of coming out and transitioning, I was playing ultimate frisbee and was trying to navigate some of the policies that are being put into place by different organizations and that come up in the legislation in different ways, as Shane was mentioning. And for me, what ended up being important in my coming out process was knowing that in the sport of ultimate frisbee back in 2017, there were few, if none, trans women voices out in the community. And it felt important to add my voice out there, if only just to say, hey, we exist, we are in these spaces, we're out on the fields playing with you and playing next to you. And I ended up just writing a piece. I'm not much of a movie or film person, but I do write a fair amount, and writing about my experiences actually gained quite a bit of traction. And the years following, and I can speak more to this later if we end up talking about policy, the governing body of Ultimate Frisbee, USA Ultimate, has continually changed their policies from a very basic, short, not very helpful policy in 2016 to a big update in 2018 to now their policy from 2020 allows anyone to compete as who they are. Really, when we're talking about sports, part of Athlete Ally's mission is that sports are really important to who we are as people, as humans, for social, for leadership, for all these different aspects. And trans people should be able to compete in sports. And it's really important that we have policies and practices and get our stories out there to really make a difference in these spaces and get people to know that trans people are people and we also are athletes, just as everyone else is.
Jenna, I feel like it's hard to follow up on that. I mean, you just articulate so much of, what I've been thinking too. And, the same points that we try to drive home all the time in our work is we're just people, you know. And I think that's one of the huge things that's so important about having these stories by trans athletes, trans voices. You know, for me, I didn't, and I imagine for for several of you as well, and not all of you, like there really aren't very many trans athlete role models out there. Um, and especially, you know, when you bring in other pieces of your identity, for me being a person of color, being Jewish, being queer, it's like the pool of people to look up to who understand where I'm coming from just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. um, and it was, um, you know, I still I don't have anyone who really totally fits the mold for me, to look up to. Um, and even in spaces where, you know, there's a lot of folks who are uh, open and you know, get different pieces, and you know, they understand the trans piece or the queer piece or the Jewish piece or the person of color piece, right? It's difficult to really um, articulate for myself, you know, how all of those things come together and really impact my day-to-day life. And that's, I think, one of the things that's been, for me, was tricky about being in field hockey. Is it's so, in the US, it's so gendered, it's so white, it's so upper middle class or middle class, or sorry, upper class. Like, you know, it's just, there's all these different pieces that come together, and it just can be very difficult sometimes to sort of find where I really fit into all of that. So visibility from people who have those same experiences is so important. And really, especially in the day and age of technology and social media, you know, I'll look at posts and be like, oh, I kind of know you now. Like, I'm hearing your voice directly in this reel, or like reading your post, or whatever the case is. And I feel like I have this connection to folks, directly with people who get where I'm coming from. So it's, that's been a really cool piece of being trans at this moment.
Yeah, I thank you everybody for sharing. I feel like there's so much insight to go off of that people have shared. But I think building on both what everybody said is really this idea of creating space for trans athletes by trans athletes, and having role models is so important, because you have our young athletes in middle school, high school, even elementary school now, and what do they have to look up to? There are some athletes out there, but there's this middle group of creating space, of being role models. And I think when we're able to do that, there's this more connection we can have and grow and see who we can be within sport. I think it's so incredibly powerful how sports operate in our lives. We can be in our bodies, do what we love, and that has all these benefits. And that's why I was so drawn to sports. But when I, you know, realized gender wasn't working for me anymore, this binary, I didn't really know how to come out in such a binary space. And I really suppressed my own just like identity for a while so I could just play sport and get through it. But I never felt fully whole, right? And at some point I was like, you got to do it now or never. And those people behind you, they can do it too. And so I think what's so important is when we can create these spaces by trans athletes, we can be role models for trans and non-binary athletes to come, and like create hopefully less barriers, and do this advocacy to create less barriers. And there's a lot of ongoing work, but you know, this Olympics was huge. We had Quinn on the Canadian national team. It's one of the first non-binary athletes. It took a few tries for the announcers to get it right, but eventually they did. And you know, media was able to correct their pronouns, and that is somewhere that's going somewhere. And so, Quinn creating space at that level for athletes to come is huge.
I'll put in my 2 cents too, because I think that, you know, everybody here has certainly, you know, voiced a really similar journey to my own experience. But I want to, you know, I want to brag on the whole group, and me included, of the idea that, like, growing up and really embodying the values of what athletics has to offer and has to teach us has most certainly impacted how I go about advocacy and how I go about my education, and whatever my next pursuit is. So just like any other, cis or straight person, the values that you learn through youth sports, through the developmental level, through college, and hopefully higher than college if you can get there, is something that is going to truly affect you for the rest of your life. And if you're able to really spin that in an optimistic sense to, use those leadership skills that you're learning, or use the teamwork skills, the ability of reading the field. I was a goalie in both of my sports, so I very much consider things from this like broad perspective, and it makes a lot of sense to me that I ended up in this sort of sociological field that also has a broad perspective. So being able to use these foundational and translational elements immediately impacts the work that I do, the fine motor details that we need to be aware of. And I think that ultimately it also translates into the stories that I have and how I shared my experiences.
I'm also thinking about, just the importance of sports and how it's, those have affected our lives. I'm working on my master's currently. I'm doing a master's of science in exercise and sports studies at Smith College, also in Western Massachusetts. I literally came here for college and never left. So here I am. And we did this exercise the other day in one of my classes where we were asked to write the top traits of the best and worst coaches we've ever had. And then we went over and shared with each other, what we wrote and what we remember about these coaches. And not a single one of us remembered a win or loss record or the stats or like the specific pep talk that we, were given before a game. It was, this coach had my back. And like, in my case, it was like my coach, supported me when I came out as trans. And when I was struggling with my mental health, she picked me up from the hospital. Like it's things like that, it's the impact on just the sports are kind of like, they're fun and they're great and everyone likes to win. But that's not what most of us in my class were taking away from our experiences with the best and worst coaches. It had nothing to do with the actual athletics piece. That's for me, that's why I love doing this work and being in the athletic space. And because it's so much more than just the motor skills and the strategy. It's about the people, and you've probably heard it before that sport is a vehicle for social change. I believe that so much. I love that because it really is. If we're looking at the history of sports and inclusion, but more so is the exclusion, how sports have been used to exclude people, right? And we're in this moment where, especially with the state legislatures, like Shane was saying before, it's been so terrible and damaging. And it's also an opportunity for us to use our platform as athletes to really take concrete steps and share why we're important, which we shouldn't have to do. But like, hey, we're all important. We're all human. And I'm starting to repeat myself, so I'm going to stop myself. But
Yeah, I do think having, oh, sorry, Hija, were you, I just saw you come off from, realize I didn't.
No, go for it. I had a thought, but you can go for it.
I was gonna say, it's definitely, it's there's quite a bit of importance in having support and background in terms of coaches, admins having our backs in different ways, especially navigating different policies and ways to integrate into different teams. I know that when I was in college, when I was in graduate school and transitioning between the men's and women's teams, it was really important to try and integrate myself into the women's team when I did move over there, because it was a very different experience, and trying to be a newly out trans woman in that space was really, really tricky. So yeah, I do think it's important, and I think we can maybe speak a little bit more to allyship and sort of how that shows up for different folks down the line. But I wanted to give Asia a chance before we maybe do a little bit of a pivot.
No, I was going to kind of speak to that about coaches, because I think back to young athletes, and a lot of these policies are affecting athletes at the middle school and high school level, which is terrible, because right, when you do that, you take away this ability for those athletes to look at collegiate programs. Like, we know trans athletes can play D1, D2, T3, right? But you take away, if they can't play, this opportunity for recruiting. They have to go out to club teams or play outside the system. That's a lot of burden, right? But I think how each coaches can be such great allies is not only at the high school and middle school level, but at the collegiate level, where these opportunities for them to further succeed is to look at your recruiting practices and like who your team and why and what your biases are there. And I think that's something that is often overlooked, or like only the best people get into these recruiting spots. But I think the practices as a whole often are not transparent and can be pretty selective or exclusive. But I think right now what's not really worked into them is, what is the background of an athlete? Who are the allies or the athletes I want on my team? How can I create diversity in our team? That's often overlooked for this concept of elite performance. We all know athletes can develop over time. Good coaching can create good athletes. So it's not about these numbers up front, right? I think coaches can do a lot of work if they're at that level to be like, how can I expand my team? How can I think more broadly, inclusively? And that goes back to listening to trans athletes and their stories and learning from that with an open heart. Like, there's nothing can be said more than have an open heart and bring that perspective in and actually really thinking it through and unpacking your own assumptions and biases. And that's kind of the hardest work we all have to do, but we have to be able to commit to it as allies.
Anything else from folks on the subject for the moment? Otherwise, I might pivot us a little bit.
Talking about allyship?
I was going to talk about allyship. We can do that. My other sort of question is, this is a theme that's come up throughout. I know in my experience, and some and Emmett and Asia certainly I think touched on a little bit, but just trying to, I think when we're talking about sports, there's a lot of assumptions that go into, well, there's men's sports and there's women's sports, and they exist in these ways for very specific reasons. But that starts to fall apart, or starts to become more difficult when we have trans athletes who are trying to navigate these spaces in different ways. And I'd be curious to either hear from folks directly in their experiences, or Shane from Changing the Game, how have trans athletes navigated the sort of differences as we exist in currently a very binary sports world? How trans athletes navigate that? What are the places of strength or the places of struggle that athletes have run into, either again in our own experiences or in Changing the Game, or from other folks that we've heard or seen around? And that's a general question to whoever wants to pick that up.
I can jump in. Thank you, Jenna. That's a great question. I think one that is a sort of top of everyone's mind right now is when we are encouraging people to be gender expansive and to move away from this gender binary that we know is so restrictive and so limiting. How do we also fit into systems that exist in binaries? Right? It wasn't until very recently that people were able to get an X gender marker on passports. I know a number of states still don't allow that. So systems inherently exclude people who do not conform to the binary. And of course, in sports, that is no different. Actually, I'm going to toss a huge pat on the back to Athlete Ally. Just today, they released a policy in conjunction with Premier Hockey League, formerly known as the National Women's Hockey League, with the most inclusive trans and non-binary sport policy that has existed. And this is based on allowing athletes to self-identify, and there's no hormone requirement, which is remarkable. And so that exists, of course, at a professional level. My area of focus and where I get the most excitement is talking about youth sports. And we've talked about this a bit already. Emmett has touched on this, but really bringing it back to the reason why people participate in sports. It's not for the win-loss. It's not absolutely, we can, there's a comment in here to share that link. We can definitely do that. It's not about the win-loss record. I can't tell you what our win-loss record was in college, but I can tell you that the friends that I made have stuck with me well beyond our years of college hockey. And that's what we want to impart to children and to young people, and to give them a space where they can belong. For so many people, that hour a day, that 2 hours a day where they can be on the track, on the field, and the court. In my case, it was on the ice. Nothing else matters. And you just get to be you, and you get to try to be the best you can be. And that's why we encourage all children to participate in sports, regardless of gender identity or inclusive of all gender identities. It's about participating and giving people a space where they belong. And as Emmett said, these are lessons that translate well after our athletic careers. And that's where I get the most excited, talking about how we can include trans youth, which is everybody gets to play, because everybody gets to play and keep playing now, even as adults.
I'll jump in with a very short version of my story and my experience, which is so in the sport of lacrosse, according to according to the NCAA policy, and the school that I was at was a Division III school. Lacrosse, if you aren't familiar with the game, has a women's version and a men's version. And if you only saw those titles on paper, you would assume that the rules, the equipment, the positioning, all of that is the same, just as it would be in hockey or basketball or soccer. And for me, unfortunately, that was not the case. And in fact, the sports, other than the titles of them, are very different. They have similarities, but for the most part, it's pretty different. And that oversight led to the language the NCAA used in their initial 2010 trans inclusion policy for student athletes. So when I came out going into my senior year and desperately wanted to finish playing with my teammates on at the time on the women's team, it forced me to make some really difficult decisions about what was best for my health, what I wanted out of my sport and college experience. And it also forced me to educate myself more to a level more in depth than our compliance officers, to our athletic director, to my coach, certainly. And regardless of whether or not the person was an ally or was, just grasping at air, trying to figure out how to help me navigate the situation, there was not a lot of input back in 2013. So that self-advocacy and that self-education was really critical. And I want to share that with, there's a whole array of stories, and I'm sure that we could all talk about, just focusing on the happy things if we wanted to, but that's certainly not the case. And there are obviously levels of severity for the more negative experiences as well. And I would consider myself very fortunate that I didn't have anything, deeply traumatic happen to me during that time. But there are, I'm hopeful now that there are other trans athletes that will have an easier journey than I did because of that self-education and that advocacy work.
I'll hop in real quick. Ryan, I'm thinking about, yeah, that the self-advocacy and education, and you and I have a little bit of time in between our our times in college together. We're both in Massachusetts, and um, it's interesting to me because by the time I came out as trans after my first semester of college in 2015, and it was spring 2015 when I came out, and I was really, really fortunate that everyone around me, for the most part, was really so welcoming and wanting to learn and wanting to do the right thing and very eager to listen to me. But they also didn't have a clue what to do or what to say about it, right? So even with the best of intentions, it it can be tricky, and at the same time, even with the best of intentions and no knowledge, there are some folks who had really great responses to me too. So for example, and this is going to pivot a little bit into allyship, if we're ready for that. I'm thinking about when I first came out, and I came out to my coach over the summer, and she asked me if I wanted to address the team, and I said I want to come out to the team. I didn't know how. It's terrifying to think about sitting in front of 24 other people and tell them that I've been struggling with my own identity and all of these things. And so what she decided was, in our very first preseason meeting, we would, not something we've ever done before, sit in a circle and go around and each share one thing that has been challenging for us over the summer, one thing that we're dealing with, that we want to share with the team so that we all have a better understanding of where we're coming from. And that was really great because it didn't single me out. And she didn't call on me first, but I had that space to talk about it. And it brought us all closer together. I mean, like, I learned things about teammates, who I thought I knew and had no idea what they were going through. So that was a really powerful way for her to be an ally without it. It wasn't performative. It wasn't like flaunting, hey, I'm doing this thing for you. It was, how are we just going to support you and support the team and build us stronger? So it can be, things like that coming from a coach, or it could be coming from teammates. One of the captains asked me one day in the locker room that season right after I came out. She said, it was in the process of, I was changing my name to Emmett, and she was like, wait, what do you want me to call you? And I was like, I don't care if you call me, my dead name. It's fine. People get it confused all the time. And I was being very modest and not really advocating for myself. And her response was, well, what do you want me to call you in 5 years? And I said, Emmett. And she was like, well, then it doesn't make any sense for me to call you something other than Emmett. And that sort of modeling in front of the team also, and it wasn't even like purposefully in front of the team. It was just, it happened in the locker room, and that people were listening because it's the locker room. Everyone listens to everyone else. It just happens. So I think allyship can be, seemingly small things like that are just daily interactions. But for me, those were huge. Like, those are things that I still remember so vividly. And we're like, I don't know how to count, 6 years out from that, right? And I still remember it like it was yesterday.
I was gonna build, I think that's a great story on allyship and what people can do, the little actions they can take on the interpersonal level. But I do also think allyship can be advocacy. I suck at saying this word, advocacy. And a level that recently I took up CrossFit in the pandemic because everybody needed a pandemic hobby and you do it outside. But the interesting thing about CrossFit, and it has a lot of critiques, it is a very cis white space as a whole when you think about it. But it also is like very powerful. You can learn about a lot of your body and muscle endurance and just like a lot of these gymnastic movements. So it's a lot of fun, except for something about CrossFit is they like to just gender everything in terms of the weight you're supposed to lift, which is super funny. Because in the end, no matter, we occupy 7 billion people on this planet, we all have different bodies that are capable of different things, no matter what our genders are. And so I think it's really wild. They're saying, you live 30, you live 40, perfect, solved, right? No, it just doesn't make any sense. But in that context, I brought it up to one of our coaches, to the gym I'm at, and they're like, what would we do? How do we don't know how to fix that. That's just the way it is. I think that's not allyship in my mind. That's like saying, I just don't know the solution to this problem, and I can't be bothered to figure it out for you or anybody else. I think that was a time where I was like, I don't really know what you can do, but I do think as an owner of this gym, as a coach that has people that are here, that you can do something and that you can take steps and do your own research and be an ally. You have a poster on this gym that says we support trans queer athletes, then follow through on actions. And I think that leadership is advocacy and actions and following through on that. And that's a time where I was like, you're just not speaking up to the values you hold. And I don't feel comfortable in this space because I feel very limited for what you're creating. And so that's a moment where I think you can really show allyship. If you don't have the answer, you don't have to have the answer, but you can do research, you can take steps to get there, and you can ask around, maybe figure it out and do the burden of the labor to change something. I think we can put, I saw the Apple Watch 7 today, which is waterproof, shock resistant, all that stuff, is that we can innovate stuff like that. We can innovate sport. It's not that hard. If you can do this stuff on a watch, we can innovate sport if we just put our effort toward it. And it's where I get really pumped up is how can we change the status quo and do something different to make this world more inclusive?
Thanks, Emmett and Huja, for those stories. I'll just throw a quick story out there as well, just to say that it can also be very simple. There are some things that are in some more organized settings can show up differently with teammates and coaches in different ways. And also, I'd like to share the story of the first time I went out to an Ultimate Frisbee pickup game in Reno, Nevada, where I was doing graduate school, and it's mostly older guys of like my parents' age or so. And it's an environment where it maybe doesn't seem very queer friendly. And I just showed up the first time after I decided to start presenting fully as Jenna and started playing with folks. And partway through, one of the guys comes over and was like, "Hey, what name and pronouns do you use?" I'm like, "Oh, Jenna, she, her. Thanks for asking." And that was it. And then my name and pronouns just sort of spread through the community. And it was that simple. It sometimes feels like there's a lot that needs to be done for allyship, that it's this big, complicated, hard thing. But sometimes it can be really simple of just accepting people, checking in what name and pronouns they use. I really like the question of, okay, well, what name are you going to use in 5 years? I think that's a really clever question. And so I think that that's really helpful to think about. And so I know that we had a question in the Q&A. Hopefully we've mostly addressed that or touched on that. I know we have another question in the Q&A of how do we combat the misinformation that trans athletes have an unfair advantage? What can we say when this comes up? So I will start because oftentimes the misinformation around trans athletes having an advantage in sports centers around trans women athletes. Me. I will say, as someone who has lost many disc golf tournaments and ultimate frisbee games and been cut from many ultimate frisbee teams for not being good enough, I am not dominating women's sports. Trans women are not dominating women's sports. So simply the fact of the matter of trans women so far not dominating women's sports, even though we've had plenty of opportunities to, and there are plenty of trans women out there who are very good athletes, we haven't dominated women's sports. First trans woman athlete in the Olympics this year, Laura Hubbard. Guess what? She didn't get gold or silver or bronze. Trans women don't dominate women's sports. The idea that there is some inherent biological advantage for trans women, for trans men folks, just doesn't exist. And the other bit about it is just to think about the variety of human beings. The assumption that one class of people will inherently always have some clear advantage over some people of another class or group doesn't make a lot of sense given the variety of people. Sure, we can say things in general, or we can point to the very upper echelons of sport, but when we're often talking about trans exclusion policies, when we're talking about anti-trans legislation, as Shane started us off with, a lot of the focus is on younger folks, is on middle schoolers, high schoolers, college students. And at that level, there is simply not enough just there to say that there are clear advantages or disadvantages one way or another. People should just be allowed to play sports. So I would say two things. One, do you see trans women dominating sports? If not, then great. And the other thing is just to think about and offer to people, think about the variety of human experience and think about, sure, we can focus on the 100 times at the Olympics for the men and the women, but those are a very, very small percentage of people in the world. And there's a lot of other people out there that have a lot of different athletic ability and background. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that, but I have very strong opinions on it, so I figured I would start on it.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. That's very well said, Jenna, and I so appreciate your perspective from your lived experience. I also, when we get this question often when talking about the film and talking about trans inclusion in sport, and I always like to counter with what is fair to you. So we're talking about this, the question says an unfair advantage. Fair is kind of subjective. And so what is fairness to you? And I'll add that sports are inherently unfair. And one of the ways that we're seeing that is in the way that men's and women's sports are differently funded. The athlete to coach pipeline is very, very different in men's and women's sports. Even the way we talk about men's and women's sports is very different, right? With the NBA and the WNBA. And so I'm just going to call out the Premier Hockey League once again, formerly the National Women's Hockey League, for taking the gender out of their name. And they are not othering themselves by calling themselves a women's league. And in doing so, they're opening up folks of all identities to participate. But the sports are inherently unfair. And by assuming that men's sports are where people are going to succeed, like why aren't there any trans men dominating men's sports? Why isn't, someone recently was like, why isn't Serena Williams playing in men's tennis? It's, again, going in reinforcing this system of inherent sexism that assumes that men's sports are better than women's sports. They're just overfitted. I think we all remember, or maybe we don't, in March Madness tournament this past year, it blew up on Twitter. There were drastically more resources available to the men's athletes than to the women's athletes, and that's not unique to college basketball. So let's think about what is fair. And if we want to talk about creating a level playing field and creating fair and equal opportunities for women and women's sports, it's got to be increased funding. We've got to have more women coaches, more player to coach pipeline. And then we can start talking about what fair looks like across the board. Sorry, I got super heated there. Whew.
Yeah, I can't have said it better than Shane and Jenna said it. And I think that was the thing that I was going to say. My first thought was this: what is a fair advantage? What is a fair advantage? Because really, when we are athletes, like, that doesn't make any sense. It's like inherently sports are unfair. Somebody has to win, somebody has to lose, and it's all based on what is brought to the field, the pitch, the court, anything in mind. But I think what's an interesting example of just how it's just unfair and wholly is, you often hear this about the statistic that the men's Canadian hockey team, all their birthdays are in January or February, like almost all of them. And it's like, why? It's because the way the leagues are set up, that you play in the same year you're born. So all those born in December have like 9 months less experience, 11 months less experience than those born in January. But that's the way it is, right? It's inherently unfair. So it's really looking at the practices that we have in place already, as Shane mentioned, the funding, what the way systems are set up, how we exclude people, and say, like, maybe we can't make sports fair the way it's set up, but like, again, can we rethink how we're doing this so that we are able to include more? Like, why do we have to continue down the same road? And really say, like, if we really want to change the world and see more people play sports, let's do that.
And just to add on to that, I mean, I think, all of these practices that Yeja, that you're mentioning, like, and the, what you pointed out, Shane, of actual, discrepancies between men's and women's sports and funding and all of that, that's just reflective of society in general, right? This sexism that we're seeing is so pervasive, and thinking also about the ways that the policing of women and their bodies shows up, right? And in particular for Black and brown women and their bodies. And so, we know that Black and brown trans women are the most at risk of all sorts of violence and harassment, and that's showing up in the way folks are targeting trans people. They're targeting Black and brown trans women athletes a lot of the time. So it's, sports are both, I think, a reflection of where we're at in society, and are also an indication of where we could be in the future. Going back to that sport as a vehicle for social change, I always come back to that.
Emmett, I love that you wrapped up on that thought too. So we're going to do a slight pivot here to our lightning round questions, because we only have a couple minutes left. But I would love to hear the group's thoughts on, with sport as a vehicle for social change, what has been the most rewarding part of this work?
I will jump in with a quick answer of the most rewarding part of the work is when there are newer transitioning or younger transitioning trans women athletes in particular reaching out to me and say, hey, I look up to you. You've helped pave the way for me. And that just means the absolute world to me.
Are we all answering, or just if we can? Yeah, I was going to echo the same. I think when I had a collegiate non-binary athlete come to me and ask for advice about how to navigate, being a non-binary athlete post-grad playing competitive sport, and it was just really heartwarming that, they saw that there was space and that it was possible.
I can jump in. I have had the privilege of working with Changing the Game on and off for just over 2 years, but in a full-time capacity since January. My background is in nonprofits, and the goal of every nonprofit is to work themselves out of a job. And so that's the hope. I hope that we don't have to be having these conversations. I hope that Changing the Game becomes a relic of the past. Panels like this become a relic of the past because we found equity. And similarly to what folks have just shared, it's amazing to hear from trans athletes that they feel like they have place because they can see the work that we're doing. And I think what's on top of mind today is the work that everyone is doing to be better allies to trans youth. We can be allies as trans elders. We can be allies as coaches, as parents, as friends, because it's going to take all of us to do the work to all boats rise when Emmett says it really well. All boats rise when the sea changes. Something we have to work together to lift everybody up, and it's going to take work from all of us. And so what keeps me coming back is hearing from people that are on this panel and people who are typing in the questions and being able to watch this online, who are passionate about creating this change to make the world a better and safer place for trans youth. You are the ones that keep me coming back to this work. Thank you.
I'll put in my little thing at the end. Thanks, Shane. It's the same thing for me. It's always the people. It's hearing, as everyone has already said, from other trans folks, and especially folks earlier on in their transition or younger, who have someone to see, to look up to. And for me, it's also the folks who are like older, who don't. My mom always goes on about the difference in generations, and that always grinds me. But The it's true, you know, she didn't have anyone when I came out as trans, like she didn't have any peers to talk to about it. And so to have folks who are like my mom's age, or folks who have kids who are trans and or not, you know, people who don't get it and don't necessarily want to get it, but they for some reason show up and hear me speak, and then they tell me afterwards that I did change their mind and I did help them to understand a little bit more. Oh, that gets me in the feels so much.
We're gonna do one more really quick lightning round this time. And this is one word, one phrase, one very brief piece of advice you would give to someone who is earlier in their transition process, younger, newer, what have you. I will start, and it is find your people, because if you can find your people, it makes a world of difference.
I'm going to jump in just because mine is very similar, but my message to everybody, there is a place in sport for you. It just might take a little while for you to find it, but there is absolutely place in sport for you.
Know that you're valued.
I think you can be your full self in sport too.
You're not alone, and you're just fine the way you are.
Thank you, everyone, for those messages. That is going to just about wrap us up. Thank you again for having us. We have been very grateful to be here within this short time for you. Obviously, there's been a lot that we have touched on, so much more that we could say in not very much time. I will pass to Mary for some of the Weglyn closing stuff. Feel free to reach out. We will do our best to share our information for folks to be able to reach out to us on social media, email, what have you. Mary, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for spending, I don't know if you can all see me, but it doesn't really matter, because I think what really matters is what we've gained from just you unpacking your lives with us and sharing your space with us. And I love the last lightning rod, because it really gave me the feels. You know, it really is like not just a place for you in sports. There's a place for you everywhere, right? And I think a lot of folks have a hard time trying to wrap their head around, you know, transgender communities or trans athletes, because they really haven't had opportunities, or maybe haven't been in a community where they're able to share or learn and build community with folks, right? And from the very beginning, you all said, we're just like everybody else. I mean, it's the same thing as if you're a person of color, or, you know, all the BIPOC folks, right? We're just like everybody else in many ways, but our differences do make us beautiful. And I celebrate our diversity. I celebrate our trans brothers and sisters, and, you know, non-binary community folks. I celebrate all of our communities of color and folks the way they want to be who they are and just being themselves. I think it's so important not to conform. And I think all of you have really shared and highlighted that for us, and have given some of us courage to be allies, and have given us some skills and, you know, tools to be able to respond to folks, you know, and to share some stories. I really hope that the participants will reach out to all of you. And I have to give, again, special thanks to Athlete Allies for really bringing our community together. I hope this is not the last. Like I said, I hope when we are back to face that we can see each other and hopefully give each other hugs in person. Daniela has put in the chat feature a survey link. If the attendees would be so kind to fill out the survey, just to let us know, what did you think? What would you like to have more? Do you want more of this? Not this, but maybe more dialogue, more conversations, more of community building, you know, with our transgender community friends, as well as family members that maybe you don't even know about, right? And so the different nuggets of truth and different nuggets of ideas that we can take with us if anyone ever comes out to us, or as an educator myself, if a student comes out, how can I respond? I would hope to be like Emmett's coach and say, you know, what would you like 5 years from now? I love that. I think there are a lot of different things that we don't realize that we can do now. that we don't have to wait for later. So with that, thank you so, so much from the bottom of my heart for all of you being here. It's so lovely to be in this space with all of you. And we are on Facebook as well. So you can, look on my site, but I'm sharing with a lot of different groups as well. And then later on, we'll also have it on YouTube. So thank you. And if you wouldn't mind, our panelists, just maybe if you're comfortable with sharing your contact information, if folks want to, I think some of you have been doing that. Thank you so much. And I know, Faye, we need more time. I think if we were in person and again, we should do this. We go out to eat afterwards, and, right? We should all go out to eat and hang out and listen to music and, just kind of build our community, expand on this. So let's do that. Let's have a reunion. That would be a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
That would be a lot of fun. Thank you to Mary and all of the folks at Kapolei Pomona and the Weglyn series for having us in this space. We are putting our info in the chat. I think all of the panelists now have our info in the chat for folks, to everyone. Also, feel free to check out Athlete Ally at athleteally.org. And one of our big projects, the AEI.athleteally.org, and our action awards that are happening in just a couple weeks on October 26th, if you're interested in checking that out. Thank you again all so much for having us and for being in this space with us.
And I think folks are just sharing their appreciation and gratitude for all of you right now on the chat. A lot of our students, a lot of our faculty, I know our provost was here earlier as well. So I think there's a lot of institutional support for the kind of work. And Iris Levine, who is our interim provost, has always been a champion for all the stuff that we've been doing. So it was great to see her here along with our Weglyn Advisory Committee. So yeah, thank you, everyone. And I'll just stay on for a little bit in case you all want to chat or anything like that. But I would love to invite you all back. I think that would be great, to be able to do something in person if your schedules permit. I know someone's in San Francisco. I can't remember who it was. Ryan?
I'm in San Francisco currently. Also, do we want to keep the recording going and the live on Facebook, or do we need to close those down?